The Supermarine Seafire was a naval version of the Supermarine Spitfire adapted for operation from aircraft carriers. The name Seafire was arrived at by abbreviating the longer name Sea Spitfire. Origins of the Seafire. The Admiralty first showed an interest in the idea of a carrier-borne Spitfire in May 1938 when, during a meeting with Richard Fairey, Fairey proposed that his company could design and build such an aircraft. The idea met with a negative response and the matter was dropped. As a result, the Fleet Air Arm, at that point still part of the Royal Air Force, was forced into having to order Blackburn Rocks and Gloucester Sea Gladiators, both of which proved to be woefully inadequate. Upon the outbreak of the Second World War, many of the aircraft operated by the FAA were considered to be obsolete in comparison to Germany's land-based fighters. Thus the need for more capable aircraft was readily apparent. The Hawker Hurricane had quickly proven to be adaptable to carrier-based operations. There was considerable interest in navalizing the Spitfire as well. The matter of a seaborne Spitfire was raised again in November 1939 when the Air Ministry allowed a Commander Ehrman to fly a Spitfire I. After his first flight in R6718, Ehrman learned that Joseph Smith, chief designer at Supermarine, had been instructed to fit an A-frame arrestor hook on a Spitfire and that this had flown on the 16th of October. A drawing of this aircraft had been shown to the FAA on the 27th of October. After further discussions, Supermarine submitted a drawing of a Spitfire with folding wings on an arrestor hook. In this case, the wings were designed with a fold just outboard of the undercarriage bays. The outer wings would swivel and fold backwards, parallel with the fuselage. On the 29th of February 1940, the Admiralty asked the Air Ministry to sanction the production of 50 folding wing Spitfires, with the first deliveries to start in July. For various reasons, Winston Churchill, who was First Lord of the Admiralty, cancelled the order, writing to Lord Beaverbrick, "I regard it as of very great importance that the production of Fulmars should be kept going. At a time of need for land Spitfires, the diversion of resources to the construction of a naval variant would reduce Spitfire production. To partially cover the gap until the Fulmars replacement was able to enter service, Grumman Wildcats were ordered from the U.S. for the FAA. These would enter service towards the end of 1940 as the Martlet development. In late 1941 and early 1942, the Admiralty assessed the Spitfire for possible conversion. In late 1941, a total of 48 Spitfire MKVB were converted by Air Training Service Limited at Hamble to become hooked Spitfires. This was the Seafire MK and would be the first of several Seafire variants to reach the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm. This version of the Seafire was mainly used to allow the Royal Navy to gain experience in operating the Spitfire on aircraft carriers. The main structural change was made to the lower rear fuselage, which incorporated an A-frame style arrestor hook and strengthened longerons. It was soon discovered that the fuselage, especially around hatches, was too weak for carrier operations. In an attempt to alleviate this condition, reinforcing strips were riveted around hatch openings and along the main fuselage longerons. A further 118 Seafire MKIBs incorporating the fuselage reinforcements were modified from Spitfire VBS by Cunliffe and at Eastleigh Air Training Service. These aircraft were equipped with naval HF radio equipment and IFF equipment as well as a Type 72 homing beacon. In these and all subsequent Seafires, the instruments were recalibrated to read knots and NMI rather than mph and mi. The fixed armament was the same as that of the Spitfire VB, two 20mm Hispano Mk2 cannon with 60 RPG fed from a drum magazine and four 303 in Browning machine guns with 350 RPG. Provision was also made to carry a 30 gallons slipper fuel tank under the fuselage. In June 1942, the first deliveries of the Seafire took place to 807 Squadron. Another frontline unit, 801 Squadron, operated this version on board HMS Furious from October 1942 through to September 1944. The second semi-naval variant of the Seafire, and the first to be built as such, was the Seafire FMKIIC, which was based on the Spitfire VC. The VC had several refinements over the Spitfire VB. Apart from the modifications included in the main batch of Seafire IBs, this version incorporated catapult spools, and a single slinging lug on either side of the fuselage, just behind the engine bulkhead. Three subtypes were produced: the FMKIIC and FRMKIIC, powered by a Merlin 46, and the LMKIIC, powered by a low-altitude Merlin 32 specifically manufactured for naval use. This version of the Merlin used a cropped supercharger impeller to provide greater power at low altitudes than the standard engines, delivering 1,585 horsepower at 2,750 feet. Both engine models drove a four-bladed 10 feet 9 in diameter rotor propeller. Because this version used the C-wing, the Hispano cannon were fed from a 120-round belt magazine. Otherwise, the armament was the same as that of the IB. The FR also carried two F-24 cameras. After trials of rocket-assisted takeoff gear apparatus in February 1943, this equipment became a standard fitting available for all Seafires. However, many FAA pilots rarely used RATOG, in part as there was little need for it, and due to the risks posed by an instance of asymmetric ignition. The IIC was the first of the Seafires to be deployed operationally in large numbers, with Supermarine building 262 and 110 being built by Westland, who also built 30 Seafire Mk3. Although developed for aircraft carrier use, this version still lacked the folding wings needed to allow them to be used on board some Royal Navy carriers, some of which had small aircraft elevators unable to accommodate the full wingspan of the Seafires. The Seafire FMK3 was the first true carrier adaptation of the Spitfire design. It was developed from the Seafire MKIIC, but incorporated manually folding wings, allowing more of these aircraft to be spotted on deck or in the hangars below. Supermarine devised a system of two straight chordwise folds. A brake was introduced immediately outboard of the wheel wells, from which the wing hinged upwards and slightly angled towards the fuselage. A second hinge at each wingtip join allowed the tips to fold down. This version used the more powerful Merlin 55, a Merlin 55M, driving the same four-bladed propeller unit used by the IIC series. The Merlin 55M was another version of the Merlin for maximum performance at low altitude. Other modifications that were made on the Spitfire made their way to the Seafire as well, including a slimmer OV air-filled 1/6-stack ejector type exhausts. The shorter barrel, lightweight Hispano MKV cannon were introduced during production, as were overload fuel tank fittings in the wings. This mark was built in larger numbers than any other Seafire variant. Of the 1,220 manufactured, Westland built 870 and Cunliffe in 350. In 1947, 12 MKIs were stripped of the naval equipment by Supermarine and delivered to the Irish Air Corps. After the Mk3 series, the next Seafire variant to appear was the Seafire FMK15, which was powered by a Griffon VI single-stage supercharger, rated at 1,850 horsepower at 2,000 feet, driving a 10 feet 5 in Rotol propeller. Designed in response to specification N. 443, this appeared to be a naval Spitfire FMK-12. In reality, the Mk-15 was an amalgamation of a strengthened Seafire 3 airframe and wings with the wing fuel tanks, retractable tailwheel, larger elevators and broad-chord pointed rudder of the Spitfire 8. The engine cowling was different to that of the Spitfire 12 series, being secured with a larger number of fasteners and lacking the acorn-shaped blister behind the spinner. The final 30 MKXVs were built with the blown teardrop cockpit canopy and cut-down rear fuselage introduced on the Spitfire Mk16. On the first 50 aircraft manufactured by Cunliffe-Owen, a heavier, strengthened A-frame arrestor hook was fitted to cope with the greater weight. On subsequent MKXVs, a new form of stink-type arrestor hook was used. This version was attached to the reinforced rudder post at the rear of the fuselage and was housed in a fairing below the base of the shortened rudder. A V-shaped guard forward of the tailwheel prevented arrestor wires getting tangled up with the tailwheel. 390 Seafire XVs were built by Cunliffe-Owen and Westland from late 1944. 6 prototypes had been built by Supermarine. One problem which immediately surfaced was the poor deck behavior of this mark, especially on takeoff. At full power, the slipstream of the propeller, which swung to the left, often forced the Seafire to swing to starboard, even with the rudder hard over on opposite lock. This sometimes led to a collision with the carrier's island. The undercarriage oleo legs were still the same of those of the much lighter Merlin engine Spitfires, meaning that the swing was often accompanied by a series of hops. As an interim measure, it was recommended that pilots avoid using full power on takeoff. There were also problems involved with this swing being strongly accentuated in the event of an asymmetric firing of the R80OG equipment. In the event none of the first-generation Griffon engine Seafires were to use R80OG at sea unless they were ranged forward of the first crash barrier on deck. The Seafire FMK-17 was a modified Mk-15. The most important change was the reinforced main undercarriage, which used longer oleos and a lower rebound ratio. This went some way towards taming the deck behavior of the Mk-15, reduced the propensity of the propeller tips pecking the deck during an arrested landing, and the softer oleos stopped the aircraft from occasionally bouncing over the arrestor wires and into the crash barrier. Most production XVIIs had the cut-down rear fuselage and teardrop canopy and an extra 33-gallon fuel tank fitted in the rear fuselage. The wings were reinforced with a stronger mainspring necessitated by the newer undercarriage, and they were able to carry heavier underwing loads than previous Seafire variants. 232 of this variant were built by Westland and Cunliffe-Owen. The Seafire FMK-45 and FRMK-45 was the next version of the Seafire to be built and the first to use a Griffon 60 series engine with a two-stage, two-speed supercharger. The prototype TM379 had been modified from a Spitfire FMK-21 prototype by Cunliffe-Owen and and featured a sting arrestor hook. Because this version was considered to be an interim type, the wing, which was unchanged from that of the Spitfire 21, was non-folding. The fuel capacity of this variant was 120 gallons, distributed in two main forward fuselage tanks. The lower tank carried 48 gallons while the upper tank carried 36 gallons, plus two fuel tanks built into the leading edges of the wings with capacities of 12.5 and 5.5 gallons respectively. The Seafire FMK-45 entered service with 778 Squadron in November 1946, and a few were modified to FRMK-45s in March 1947 by being fitted with two F-24 cameras in the rear fuselage. 50 FMK-45s were built by the Castle Bromwich factory. The Seafire FMK-46 and FRMK-46 was a Spitfire FMK-22 modified to naval standard and featured the cut-down rear fuselage and teardrop canopy. Again, the wing had not been modified to fold. The electrical equipment was changed from a 12-volt system to 24 volts. The fuel system was modified over that of the Seafire 45 to incorporate an extra 32 gallons fuel tank in the rear fuselage, while the wings were plumbed to allow for a 22.5 gallons combat tank to be carried underneath each wing. In addition, a 50 gallons drop tank could be carried under the fuselage. In April 1947, a decision was made to replace the Griffon 61s or 64s driving a 5-bladed Rotol propeller unit with Griffon 85s or 87s driving two 3-bladed Rotol contra-rotating propellers. All but the first few incorporated larger tail units from the Spitfire and Seafire. These two changes transformed the handling of the aircraft by eliminating the powerful swing to starboard of previous Griffon-engined variants. 200 of the Mk-46s were ordered, but only 24 were built, all by Supermarine. The final version of the Seafire was the Seafire FMK-47 and FRMK-47. There was no true prototype. Instead, the first production aircraft, PS-944 and PS-945, served as trials aircraft. As the definitive carrier-based Seafire, the Mk-47 incorporated several refinements over earlier variants. After the first four aircraft, with manually folded wings, the Mk-47 incorporated hydraulically powered wing folding. The outer wings folding upwards in one piece, without the folding wingtips of earlier marks. All Mk-47s adopted the Rotol contra-rotating propellers. The Mk-47 also featured a long supercharger air duct, the intake of which started just behind the spinner, and a modified curved windscreen, similar to that used on the Mk-17. Other features unique to the Mk-47s were spring-loaded elevator tabs, a large inertia weight in the elevator control system, and beading on the trailing edges of the elevators. These changes improved longitudinal stability, especially when the aircraft was fully loaded. The modified windscreen proved to be unpopular with pilots because of continual problems with misting, and the thicker, repositioned frames obstructed visibility during deck landings. In spite of recommendations to change the windscreen back to a standard Spitfire 24 unit, this was never done. Performance tests showed that the Mk-47 was slightly slower than the Mk-46 in maximum and climbing speeds, mainly due to the long supercharger air intake, which was less efficient than the shorter type fitted to earlier Seafires. The Seafire 47 saw action with 800 Squadron on board HMS Triumph during the Malayan Emergency of 1949 and during the Korean War in 1950. However, in 1951 all Seafires were withdrawn from frontline service. In all, 90 FMK-47s and FRMK-47s were built, all by Supermarine. VR-971, the last of the 22,000 aircraft built under the Spitfire Seafire program, left the production line at Supermarine on 28 January 1949. Assessment: the Spitfire's original role, in which it proved formidable, was that of short-range land-based interceptor. As a carrier-based fighter, the design was a compromise and suffered many losses through structural damage caused by heavy landings on carrier decks, a problem that continued even with the strengthening introduced by the Mk2. The Seafire had a narrow undercarriage track, which meant that it was not well suited to deck operations. The many modifications had shifted the center of gravity up, making low-speed control difficult, and the aircraft's gradual stall characteristics meant that it was difficult to land accurately on the carrier, resulting in many accidents. Other problems included the basic Spitfire's short range and endurance, limited weapons load, and that it was dangerous in ditching. The first Seafire variant to overcome many of these problems was the Mk17, with its new undercarriage design, reinforced structure and extra fuel tanks, although there were still some compromises, and it entered service well after the war was over. The low point of Seafire operations came during Operation Avalanche, the invasion of Salerno in September 1943. Of the 106 Seafires available to the British escort carriers on 9 September, only 39 were serviceable by the dawn of D-Day +2. Part of this was attributed to flat, calm conditions, meaning that there was not enough headwind to stop the Spitfire float on landing. Many Seafires missed picking up the arrestor wires and flew into the crash barriers, while others had their arrestor hooks pulled off the fuselage, because they caught the wires at too high a speed. In spite of these problems, the Seafires were given the role of low to medium altitude interceptor, acting as a cap protecting the immediate vicinity of the carrier fleet from low-altitude attackers, while the longer-ranging fighters, such as the Hellcats, took on a similar role further out and at higher altitudes. Operational history: the Seafire II outperformed the A6M5 at low altitudes when the two types were tested against each other in World War II. Contemporary Allied aircraft specifically designed for carrier use, such as the Grumman F-6F Hellcat and the Vought F-4U Corsair, were considerably larger and more robust, and generally more powerful. The more powerful Seafire III enjoyed better climb rates and acceleration than these other fighters. Late-war Seafire models equipped with Griffon engines enjoyed a considerable increase of performance compared to the Merlin engine predecessors. The Griffon-powered Seafires had some serious faults. The main problem was a result of the increased power yielded by the Griffon engine. The increase in torque meant the pilot had to continuously correct the flight of the aircraft. This was a huge problem when attempting to take off and land from an aircraft carrier. The torque also affected the lift of the right wing, which would lose lift and even stall at reasonable speeds. The increased weight of the engine meant that the takeoff had to be longer and proved very dangerous from most British carriers. The increased weight of the engine further affected the center of gravity that Mitchell had concentrated on so carefully in the original Spitfire. As a result, the handling of the aircraft suffered. Eventually, most of these problems were fixed in Seafire 47 when the six-bladed contra-rotating propeller was adopted. During 1942 and into 1943, FAA squadrons progressively converted to the Seafire, eventually replacing the Sea Hurricane in frontline service. In November 1943, 1942, the first combat use of the Seafire occurred during in Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa. For the decks of several escort and fleet carriers, unusually, Seafires flew with American star markings during the operation. These were removed following their withdrawal from the theater. In July 1943, the Seafire was used to provide air cover for the Allied invasion of Sicily, and reprised this role in September 1943 during the subsequent Allied invasion of Italy, being used to maintain continuous air cover of the beachheads, the type being almost entirely responsible for this task. During the latter operation, around half of the task force's Seafires were inoperable within 4 days, primarily due to landing accidents. During 1944, Seafires were used for air cover in support of several aerial bombing missions against the German battleship Tirpitz. In June 1944, multiple Seafire squadrons were used during the Normandy landings for the purpose of locating inland targets for naval gunnery batteries to attack. During this operation, these aircraft had been placed under RAF control and were operated from shore bases. These were returned to FAA control in July 1944. In August 1944, Seafires were used to support Allied ground forces during Operation Dragoon in southern France. During the latter half of the war, the Seafire saw increasing service as part of Britain's contribution to the Far East Pacific campaigns, serving with No. 887 and 894 squadrons, Fleet Air Arm, aboard HMS Indefatigable, and joining the British Pacific Fleet late in 1944. As range quickly became a detrimental factor in Pacific operations, Seafires in this theater were often fitted with additional fuel tanks previously used by Curtiss P-40 Warhawks. Due to the good high-altitude performance and lack of ordnance-carrying capabilities, the Seafires were allocated the vital defensive duties of combat air patrol over the fleet. During May 1945, Seafires were used to cover the Allied landings at Rangoon for Operation Crimson. Seafires were thus heavily involved in countering the kamikaze attacks during the Okinawa landings and beyond. The Seafire's best day was the 15th of August 1945, shooting down 8 attacking aircraft for 1 loss. During the campaign, 887 NAS claimed 12 kills and 894 NAS claimed 10 kills. The top-scoring Seafire pilot of the war was Sub-Lieutenant R. H. Reynolds DSC of 894, who claimed 4.5 air victories in 1944-5. Post-war, the Fleet Air Arm replaced its Merlin-powered Seafires with Griffon-powered aircraft, initially with the Seafire Mk-15 and Mk-17, and from 1948 by the definitive Seafire Mk-47. In 1950, HMS Triumph started a tour of the Far East, embarking 800 Naval Air Squadron with Seafire 47s along with 827 Naval Air Squadron equipped with Fairey Fireflies. Following the outbreak of the Korean War, HMS Triumph was diverted to operations to try to stem the North Korean offensive. Seafires flying ground attack and combat air patrols from July until September 1950, when HMS Triumph was replaced by HMS Theseus, equipped with Sea Furies. During operations off Korea, Seafires flew 360 operational sorties, losing 1 aircraft shot down by friendly fire from a B-29 Superfortress and a second aircraft lost when its arrest hook failed to extend. The Seafire proved more more vulnerable to the stresses of carrier operation, with many aircraft suffering wrinkling of the rear fuselage brought about by heavy landings. Following the end of operations, when peacetime airworthiness rules were reimposed, all but 3 of 800 squadron Seafires were declared unserviceable owing to wrinkling. The Royal Canadian Navy and French aviation naval also obtained Seafires to operate from ex-Royal Navy aircraft carriers following the end of World War II. Canada's Seafire MKXVs were flown from HMCS Magnificent and HMS Warrior before being replaced by Sea Furies in 1948. France received 65 Seafire MKIIs, 24 of these being deployed on the carrier Arromanches in 1948 when it sailed for Vietnam to fight in the First Indochina War. The Seafires operating from land bases and from Arromanches on ground attack missions against the Viet Minh before being withdrawn from combat operations in January 1949. After returning to European waters, the Seafire units were re-equipped with Seafire XVs, but these were quickly replaced by Grumman F6F Hellcats from 1950. The Irish Air Corps operated Seafires for a time after the war, despite having no naval air service nor aircraft carriers. The aircraft were operated from Baldonnel much in the same way as normal Spitfires, but retaining the folding wings. During the 1950s, an unsuccessful attempt to recycle the Merlin engines was made, by replacing the ailing Bedford engine in a Churchill tank with an engine from a scrapped Seafire. On the 19th of June 1954, the last Spitfire in Irish service was withdrawn. In the Fleet Air Arm, Spitfires and Seafires were used by a number of squadrons, the Spitfires used by training and land-based squadrons. 12 800 series squadrons used Spitfires and Seafires. Several units of the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve also flew Seafires post-war, including 1831, 1832 and 1833 squadrons. Operators: Canada Royal Canadian Navy, France French Navy Aéronavale, Ireland Irish Air Corps, United Kingdom Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm, Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve. Specifications: data from British Aircraft of World War II and the Virtual Aviation Museum. General characteristics: crew 1. Length 30 feet 2.5 in. Wingspan 36 feet 10 in. Height 11 feet 5 in. Wing area 242.1 feet squared. Empty weight 6,204 pounds. Max takeoff weight 7,640 pounds. Power plant 1 times Rolls-Royce Merlin 55M liquid-cooled V12, 1,585 horsepower. Performance: maximum speed 359 miles per hour at 5,100 feet. Cruise speed 218 miles per hour. Range 513 miles. Service ceiling 32,000 feet. Rate of climb 1.9 minutes to 5,000 feet. Citations. Bibliography.